What is this thing that has happened to us? It's a virus, yes. In and of itself, it holds no moral brief. But it's definitely more than a virus. Some believe it's God's way of bringing us to our senses. Others, that it's a Chinese conspiracy to take over the world. Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thanks, lovely to see you all here, and welcome to episode 8 of the Castlemaine Commons, How Does Change Happen? And we've certainly set the bar high, starting with Arundhati Roy, and invite a high level of poetry and incisive analysis following on from that. I'd just like to acknowledge that we are here on Dja Dja Wurrung country, the land of the Jarrah people. And I'd also really like to pay my respects to the incredible power and leadership of First Nations people, both here locally now and across the continent through time. I think when we talk about this question about how does change happen, we could spend an entire episode digging into the enormity of ways that First Nation people have provided leadership and change making in this country. We got the first legal centres, the first women's shelters, the first community television stations. So many things have been driven by incredible struggles of First Nation people. So it's really important to acknowledge at the top of the show. And thanks for joining us, Cass. We'll be definitely speaking more about this through this conversation. The Castlemaine Commons is a collective of people that came together really quickly as the pandemic came upon us and decided to put together this weekly program. This is week 8. We're going to do 10, and we'd really love to hear people's feedback to think about how we keep going with them and what they could look like. So we invite you to use the chat function in the YouTube, introduce yourselves, let us know who you are, your ideas and your questions throughout. We really wanted to kind of use this opportunity to create a space to continue to connect with one another, to share ideas, to try and understand what's happening, to talk about taking actions, and to build a stronger, braver local future. So in all of the shows that we've had and in all the conversations, there's kind of been a through line that we've had about questions about change. We've never necessarily explicitly addressed it, but it's one of the reasons why we wanted to have a show where we actually put that front and center, because it's kind of been a subtext of a lot of the conversations that we've been having. But even though we started with the bar of Arundhati Roy, and I do recommend people check out the whole of that beautiful piece that she did about the pandemic is a portal. We're not seeking to find a final answer or a neat way of working our way through this question of how change happens. And I think it's actually really hard to do that right now in the middle of the pandemic. However, we've gathered some really amazing thinkers to bring together some different reflections about ways that people have observed change happening, or that they've been engaged working in communities or with organisations to help the intentional about making change happen. And yeah, we hope to have a really engaged discussion with the audience, so please throw your questions at us. I suppose the other kind of things that I just wanted to sort of say at the top is that how you think change happens, or how we might talk about change happening, has a lot to do with who you are and your experience and your perceptions, your bias. And so we recognise that we all, we're all coming to this conversation from different places, but we're probably all around the same age, I reckon. So, and we're all women, and we've got 4 white women and 1 First Nations woman, but there's, and that's not to say that's all that we are. We're a lot more. There's a lot more diversity amongst us, but there's other voices that aren't in this conversation, and we recognise that we can't possibly speak for everyone and all perspectives, but we're going to do our best to jump around between a whole lot of things and cover quite a bit of ground. So I'm not going to introduce everybody. Their bios are going to be pasted into YouTube, but one of the things I was talking about with Holly earlier today was just that it is a bit of a foggy time. And I think when you just kind of think about the last sort of 5 months, 6 months, we've had the bushfires, the pandemic, and now we're seeing incredibly powerful unrest starting in America, but leading out globally for a conversation about racial justice. And it's hard to kind of make sense of it all at once. So I guess I just wanted to ask the question, which is tricky, but what do people think is happening right now? And I might throw to you, Kath, if you're happy to jump in. What do you think is kind of happening in this multi-layered moment of all these things at once?
I think for me, I know it sounds really crazy, but for starters, country is speaking to us if we don't make these changes. As human beings, we have to make change. And the really big thing which tears me apart, what's happening in America and here in Australia, is the look, I get it. I get the we've gone from one thing to the other, and in regards to what's happening over in America, my heart goes out to the people, because I can really feel why they're doing what they need to do. It's called desperation, and it's called it got to a point where it's just too much. And sometimes, and I often can feel it myself at times, even though people don't like, it feels like, being the angry black woman, but I can understand. It gets to a point where you've been loving and kind for so long, saying the same thing, and people don't seem to hear what you have to say. And this is systems, and people say the system's broken, but I think the system was wrong from the very beginning. So, and this is just what's happening, and it's terrible. And I understand. I get that people need to fight. We fight every day. So I just think it's I'm finding it hard, but I'm not surprised. And even though it's out advertised a lot now, this has been going on for a long time, for us 230 years and more than that. So I understand there's a lot of energy, and because people are actually seeing it on the news, what's happening, and seeing, like, it's riding people's in their lounge rooms. But I suppose I get to the level a little bit of frustration because this is happening all the time. This is happening in Victoria. This is happening in our people right at your back door, and I just I feel that it's just going to continue to get like that until people are listened and people are treated, with equality and compassion and love.
And do you think that people? Sorry, Kath.
That's okay. You asked the question again. Yep. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, do you think that people do you notice, because we're thinking about sort of this question of change, do you think that obviously, you know, you see a system that has remained unchanged and violent for a long time, but in this particular moment, do you see change? Are people responding differently to what they're seeing in America? Are people coming to you with different questions or requests or listening in different ways?
Well, definitely, it's really interesting when you get to a place of desperation. It's not, you actually are finally listening. So I feel like a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and First Nations people across the world have been saying this business for a long time, but it's like, it feels like sometimes to change human behavior or a human's way of seeing the world, we have to get to this seemingly, which is sad, a point of desperation where people are forced to see the world in a different way and forced to see that there has to be a different way of it. And especially it's moving people into that sense of uncomfortability. People don't make change when they don't feel uncomfortable, when they feel like, you know, that if it's not affecting their own lives, people don't often make that change. And you can feel like you're saying the same thing until you're blue in the face, but ultimately that the things that people are saying now is because there's the energy, and it's going to continue because it's so sad though. It's getting so bad that it's got to the point that people have to fight back. They have to do that because they're fighting for survival. And what I just want constantly to make clear is, yes, it's horrific what is going over in America, but it is also horrific what is also happening here. And I think it's time for change. And I loved the beginning quote, because it is about, if we don't use this time, if having massive bushfires over here and having the virus come in and completely turn our world upside down, if we don't get the message from this, which is happening over America, people, you know, the powers to be aren't getting the message, then I think it's going to get worse. And that's what my heart feels, and not better. It's got to the point now we have to really, we have to really be determined to make the change and not go back into what we consider was normal, because that wasn't working. Yep.
100%. Thanks, Kath. And another thing that Arundhati Roy did say in that same piece was that a crisis is like a societal MRI. You know, it kind of reveals what lies beneath. And Julie talked about this today, about like ripping off the Band-Aid and showing us, revealing the system. And Julie, perhaps you want to jump in and follow on from that.
Yeah, so for me, I think what's been clear about this is that we've had a mass exposure to what the reality of our lives actually is. So we've been able to see the systems that are operating underneath the surface that most of the time we don't see, or we look away from, or we've got all these adaptations on top, and that in a polite way it works well enough and we continue with it. But there's a reality to what we're having to deal with at the moment that's made us aware of the fact that we lead maybe a precarious life, that we're in fact more interdependent than we may have thought, and that we're more connected. I'm thinking specifically of the pandemic and the impact of the virus. And one of the things that I read from Dr. Simon Weston, who's somebody I follow in the leadership sphere, is that he actually described COVID-19 as evolving within a network of animals and humans, viruses and marketplaces, urban density and social etiquettes, political actions and decisions, economic practices, globalised trade, mass travel, and digital information networks. A stable network formed, allowing the new virus to become a pandemic. So it took all of those elements of the bits of our life to come into play, and the pandemic erupted. And he would say that's actually a stable network, not a one out of the box sort of event. And I reckon we're having more and more of these disruptive, stable networks forming, and they're the things that are impacting us in very deep personal and human ways and exposing our precariousness.
And And Holly, you work with the Common Social Change Library, and you've also, one of the things I'd love to hear about from you as well is the ways that movements are adapting to the restrictions or ignoring the restrictions of the pandemic. And also, yeah, what you were talking about, this idea of the emotional life of movements, and that really struck me. So what do you sort of observe happening? What kind of change do you see?
Well, as I was listening to Kath and Julie, I had this metaphor kind of come to me, and given you gave a bit of an invitation for poetry, I thought I'd go with the metaphorical to start with. And I was thinking about the movement of tectonic plates, you know, so the land on which we stand, we're all on these plates that are sort of skimming on the surface of that, you know, layer of lava of the earth. And geography was not the subject that I did really well at in school. I did better in history and things that set me up for a life involved in the political struggle, really. But I was really thinking about how those plates move slowly, and when we're in social movements, we're often really working over the long term to try to shift things, and it can feel like sometimes we can't see the change happening at all. And then there's these moments when the plates collide a lot more violently, you know, and we see this, you know, we see the big uprisings of people being not tolerating the situation anymore. We see breakthroughs in terms of like critical mass of support for a movement kind of showing up in different ways. We see people changing sides and deciding to stand in solidarity with the movement. We've seen some really beautiful expressions of that in the US recently, with the bus drivers refusing to, you know, carry protesters to jail, and a family whose restaurant was burnt down, saying that, you know, they accepted it as part of what had happened, that they supported the movement. So I think there's something that's been really intense with the pandemic in terms of you know, people in movements working for change over time, trying to affect things, and then having a whole bunch of kind of autonomy taken away by this big external crisis, this big thing that's changed the circumstances in which we're working. But people are incredibly adaptable and innovative, and certainly the emphasis I've seen has been really on keeping safe and being ahead of the government regulations in some respects as well, being like ready to start to make changes in how things happened. But you know, also really committed to keeping the pressure on around those issues that are really important. So people have done, you know, found new ways, you know, used a whole bunch of tactics that have been used forever that fit with physical distancing and keeping people safe. But also tweaked and changed things. You know, people moved online incredibly quickly. That's happened across the whole society, but I think activists probably already had a bunch of practice in that space, and, you know, moved community groups into meeting online, moved actions online in innovative ways, and have like found online and offline ways to keep giving expression to people's concern. And yes, one thing I was just thinking about is Daniel Hunter, who's an activist and an educator and a writer from the US, talks about activated social values. So like, how do people put their values into action? And that in movements, that's what we're giving people the opportunity to do, have ways to take actions that reflect the values that are most important to them. And we see that in so many different ways. And I'm always just really impressed with the creativity that people bring to crafting that and opening space for people to be able to act.
Yeah, and I think that idea of activating social values, even the commitment to social distancing, aside from any police fines and, you know, the punitive approach to that, I think we can see a real expression of care, and we've talked about that on previous shows in terms of the mutual aid and the neighbourhood organising and stuff. Yeah. And Natalie, I'd love to come to you to hear a bit about what you see, but also perhaps you might be able to weave in a bit of a response to this question about that Tim asked about how do we keep an eye on these structures that have now been uncovered, because you're probably someone who can see, and actually probably everyone on this call and many of our listeners look at systems and structures a lot. So perhaps it's not a surprise, but it's at these moments where it's more broadly revealed. So yeah, what are your sort of observations of the changes that are happening at the moment and how we keep our eyes open, I guess?
I'm on mute. Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, so I work across a number of different communities and organisations, mostly not in the activist sector. I've been doing quite a lot of work with farmers up north, various different groups across Australia in different government-funded programs, and a lot of work in the Pacific. So I'm really quite privileged in that I get to see change from all these different perspectives all the time. So there's a couple of reflections that I have. I think a couple of frameworks that I constantly use. One is the complexity framework, which goes from simple to complicated to complex and then chaotic. And that most of the time, most of the government responses are simple and complicated, and that most movement building or the ways we make change happen through more empowerment approaches and movement building, that's more in the complicated domain. However, with the pandemic and with what's going on in the States at the moment, that's now shifted into that chaotic zone field. And that's a very different way of operating. And what I've really noticed is being very much drawn into, in my what I would call mainstream work, climate change has just been part of every conversation for the last 2 years, I think. And even some of those domains, I can't use the word climate change, but that's what we're dealing with. And people, what I've really noticed is that people are grappling with pace, and that normal, I think they're implying that normal has a normal pace. We plan it, we do it, and then we reflect upon it, and we try to get a little bit better. However, with climate change, I think we've been really struggling with that pace, because the weather events are hitting farmers and they're hitting people on the land and they're hitting a number of people. And they can't quite manage the pace. It's a crisis, but it's not like a fire or a flood. And that's really different. And so everybody's grappling with that. What pace do we move? And then with the pandemic, all my clients, I had to facilitate a conversation around the shock of the pace and how rapid it was and how quick it was. And people couldn't position how they make change happen within that pace. And one other thing I noticed there was different personalities coping with that rapid change. Some people just went to ground, other people opened up and went for it.
Yeah, but come back to you, Julie, because you were talking about the difference between crisis and slow emergencies, and the way that, the pace affects the way that we respond.
Yeah, so I think one of the most extraordinary things is how quickly we've been able to move in response to what emerged and it is still emerging through the pandemic. One is how quickly we moved to being cashless.
Mm.
So some of this is existential threat. None of us want to die. So we took a clean path and a fast path to get there. But some of it's also this activating of social values. And what that says to me, how quickly we took up social distancing, for example, how quickly we adjusted to working from home and businesses adjusted to allowing us to work from home. So sometimes, like Natalie, I get really intrigued as to the pace of things. And I think there's a difference between a crisis and what we experience as a long, slow emergency. So for many of us who are working in the environmental or the agricultural spaces, climate change is like a long, slow emergency. What is it that we can do that actually makes it more compelling and urgent in the way a crisis is urgent? And maybe it's not the push or the force, like how can we make it bigger and faster, whatever. Maybe it's the pull. And when I look at maybe the big change, especially in who's now interested in climate change and who's advocating for it and what we need to do to mitigate and adapt, it's It's people who are being pulled either because of existential concerns around their children and the world, or it's because we're activating enough social values. So there's a sort of an odd yin and yang, I think. So there's sort of clock time and there's change time. Clock time is the slowness of time going. Can you imagine if the government had tried to move us to a cashless society? It would have been a 3-year implementation process. And yet we managed to do it in like weeks.
And the other thing with that, what I'm finding is that if people, like, it's a climate emergency, and so the language around an emergency, working with the farmers, it's like an emergency, and all our language around that is it starts and it stops. Whereas the climate emergency doesn't stop. And so people didn't have the language to explain it, or the systems, because, you know, you can turn those emergency systems on intensely for a short period of time and then they stop. So there's something in the middle there with the climate emergency that we need new language.
Cass?
Can I just say, we actually do things a little bit differently. I would probably say we are in a constant state of change, and we are it's almost become part of our genetics. We're in a constant state of adapting for survival, and we're in a constant state of also listening to our ancestors and moving towards the future. We've had to have to function that way, and we have to constantly be thinking about survival and sustainability and looking to the future. Who's going to succeed us? Can we build up people that are going to move forward into the future as leaders? So it's also cyclic for us always, and ultimately a lot of decisions or how we move and be. I know it might sound weird, but I actually don't always feel I'm making those decisions. Like I read a letter last night, and I woke up, and that's for me, from my perspective, it was something that I had to do because it was my ancestors being bossy. So it's just constant. It's a different way, very much, of seeing the world. And I would say we don't stop and start change. We are just constantly in that state of motion. And even our programs, we are constantly adapting to what our community is needing and what that needs to look like. So that's just just feeling that was different.
Yeah, and I'll come to you in a sec, Holly. I was just going to say it's a really good point to where I sort of wanted to shift the conversation a bit, because we've been talking a lot about change that happens to us. So an emergency happens or a fire happens, and we can look at history to a whole range of ways that First Nations people have had things done to them. But Kath, what you're starting to talk about is when people are self-determining the ways in which they enact change. And that's sort of what I wanted to come to and ask people what they see as the ways in which that they think that, we were thinking about this idea of preferred approach, but it could be intuitive sense or what we think works best or what might work best now. But Holly, perhaps that doesn't fit with what you're going to say, so go for it, and then we can come back to this.
Oh, I just really want to appreciate Kath's observation around being in constant change. And I think something's been going on for some people who are used to a higher level of stability or comfort, where the pandemic has been a big shock, and there's an urge to want to go back to normal, or we're hearing from a lot of people that they don't want to go back to the way life was before. But they're also, in times like this, there's real risk of like heading in authoritarian directions, because people being attracted to leaders who seem to offer stability and security. And definitely that, that's being exploited in the US at the moment, and it's a risk. So something about honing our resilience to be able to continue to hold change, like experience change and welcome change and ride change, because as others have observed, it's not like you get through one crisis and then there's calm. There's just crisis followed by crisis, change followed by change. And it's about how do we build the capacity to be able to navigate that change with each other.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to ask everyone now a bit more of this question of, like, if we're on the front foot, if it's not just happening to us, how do we, and someone asked, how do we hold on to the good things that we've seen emerge during the pandemic? How do we get behind the leadership that you're talking about, Kath? How do we bring, focus to the climate crisis. I might come to you, Natalie, and just see what you think about how we can kind of be on the front foot of determining the direction of change.
Well, there are many different change theories, which I'm not going to go to in detail. And I think more and more that I get employed to design different people's change models. And
you're our in-house change nerd.
Yeah,
systems
that's me.
Thinker expert.
Like a change model that the government often uses, and big NGOs, that might be like there's delivery of services. That's one thing. A lot of projects use a behaviour change model, which is you give people the knowledge and the skills, you talk to them, and that will change their attitude, and then that will lead to them changing their behaviour. So a lot of the sort of health promotion work, a lot of the workshopy type situations, mothers groups, things like that, use the behaviour change model. Another one that's quite popular at the moment is the partnership model, where we try to work with a kind of like an equal partner to change a system. A couple of other models would be like the champion model, where you use a famous person to get up and say something. A model that I've used a lot is an empowerment model. So I use that model a lot. It's where I'm working with people, and we talk about power and how to enable people that tend to be relatively voiceless to have more power to step up and voice their power. And I think that's been used a lot, that model. However, and I think probably Holly could probably talk a lot more about this one, but more and more we're thinking around movement building and what I call maybe influencing and advocacy or alliance building models. So in the mainstream world, we might call that networking, which is where we get to know peer-to-peer. But we, in more of an advocacy space, we'd call that alliance building. And in a kind of mainstream space, we might call that collaborative practice or collective impact, where a number of different partners and people from all different walks of life are trying to actually change a system. And there's people try to unpack a system and do systems change, which is more profound change. There's just a few little glimpses. And in a minute, I think I want to unpack resilience building, but Julie's probably best placed to talk about that.
Let's dig into this question of systems change, because I reckon that's what we're all here for. We've got about 25 minutes left. So transformative systems change. How do we do it, everyone? We'll just do a quick whip around. Julie, go for it.
I wish now this is where I bring in my piece of paper with a mind map as big as an A6 size or whatever.
Draw it.
Yeah. Draw it. All right. So my expertise is in the management of the design and management of transitions, and so it's all very well to have, and it's really good to have ideas about theories and models of change that suit particular times and people, but it's really the context in which we're trying to work with complexity. And so it's the politics and it's the culture and it's how can we equalise knowledge between participants in this system, and then how do we get from here to there, or how, using the butterfly metaphor, do we change from this thing to that thing? And that nearly always engages some form of loss. So, because there are things to be put down before you can pick up other things in really deep transformative systems change. And I think one of the interesting things in the pandemic is that we've had a forced experience of things that we've had to put down, or a type of life that's changed, and new things that have come into our life we now want to keep. And so we need to do a bit more sorting and sifting around, do we universally agree about what we can leave behind and what we can pick up and move towards? Because often the leaving behind have things to do with identity and attachments and history and all sorts of things around us that are actually quite difficult for us to leave behind. And so given that, as Kath has talked about so well at the beginning, people are a bit up to here with stuff, asking them to drop familiar, comfortable things without containing the anxiety and without good leadership, to embrace new things is a really big ask at this point. So I'll be curious about how we can hold on to things that some of us have decided are the really important things we want to take into the next bit. I've got other practical things I can talk about, but maybe you'd want to ask other people too and then come back to me at the end, because there are things I think that are really more helpful in this time with some of the changes that we're dealing with in a systems way. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Holly, I'll come to you, and then I'm going to come back to you, Cass, as well. But Holly, I saw you taking furious notes there.
Sure. Yeah, just getting my thoughts in order, really. And I feel like it is a foggy time of shifting and recalibrating and making sense of what's happening and what are the different levers and what does power look like in this situation. As people have mentioned, my focus is on movement building and supporting organisations and campaigns to be powerful and effective. And so if we think about change coming about through people power, really that's about growing social movements, which are really broad categories. There's all sorts of different people acting within a social movement in different ways with different ideology, different goals a lot of the time, but kind of a broad allegiance to some principles or some desires that they're trying to pursue. There's a whole bunch of people doing a whole bunch of things. I think people power is about like bringing more people into the movement, but it's not just about more people. It's about those people being prepared to take more and more action over time, which may involve like greater levels of risk and commitment. It's about people growing in strength and skill to be able to be more effective. And it's about growing alignment so that people are able to act together for that collective action impact, for action to add up to more. And then circling back to kind of what we mentioned at the beginning, this emotional dimension is really crucial, I think. So in order for people to act and, sign up to be part of things and to give more and more of themselves over time, that we need to be kind of connecting with people on emotional levels. And that's why we see at different times, big trigger events that happen, there's an emotional dimension to that. There's urgency that people are like, something needs to stop right now. There's like hopefulness, something opens up that people think, wow, we can actually make a difference here. Something's going to shift. Let's all get on board. There's something grievous has happened that people are just so angry about that they just can't take it anymore. And also there's, a sense of solidarity of that we're in this together. So we've got, a live case study happening right now with Black Lives Matter that, solidarity has been built over time in terms of a big identification with the cause. There's been, just the emphasis on life and the way that that's kind of really brought people emotionally into the movement. The anger that happens when there's, something so unjust happens and it's able to be amplified, and that sense of urgency. So I think, some of the things we've talked about with slow emergencies, sometimes it's hard for people to find that emotional connection there because it's not been cut for them in a way where they, feel urgent about it or can see that they can make a difference, that if they act, it's going to make a difference. And that's one of the things I think we need to kind of keep figuring out with people, is how to, kind of make that connection.
Thanks. And Cass, as someone who works for change on so many levels simultaneously, you probably have about 15 responses that go in every direction of your work as a teacher and a mentor and a leader and so on, but really curious about your thoughts.
Yes, I've been often trying to put my power for change because when I'm looking back over and systematic change, and I think there's a few things. Firstly, I feel I very much function from an Indigenous relational worldview. So because of that, I am constantly trying to, first of all, understand the different world, and then translate it. I almost have to constantly look at the whole picture and almost look at the design and the function and what's working, what's not working, and then almost try to flip on its head to disrupt it, and then bringing it back to what that means for change. So there's that one. There's also the fact that fear. So I think because of the state of desperation that we are in for change, fear sort of goes by the wayside for us, because all of us, of course, and also there's no I, we work for the greater good, and we work for the greater good of a whole race of people, or even humankind. So it's like that creates the translating and thinking so big picture in transformation. And the fact that I find, probably sounds silly, but I don't know how else to explain it. I really listen to people's heart, and I really listen to what they're needing and what they're wanting. And then when I keep doing that and listening to more people's heart and really hearing what they're saying, because some people say things out of their mouths and their words, but their body and their heart is saying something different. So it's literally like collecting people's heart talk into a giant collective and going, that's what needs to happen. So, and therefore, because so many people, I believe, are craving that shift, they're craving for their heart to be heard, then that's really to the core of what often where people are wanting the change to happen, because they want that to impact them and affect them on that level. So for me, my research at the moment is systematic change within the school system, just a small thing, but it's meaning we don't fear that, because we have so much to fear already. Like there's so much terrible stuff happening, even Victoria. The incarceration rates now are as high than ever. Out of home care, our kids, higher than ever. The education system is going backwards. It's our kids are de-identifying because they don't feel safe at school. It's this constant. Still, nothing is getting taught within the curriculum, within the education system, and it's because of people's fear. But if people only realised, if we took the fear out of the equation and we actually all came together in that space, I think people have seen that during the COVID-19 time, that we can actually come together and be more for each other than what people realise, and we actually have more in common, and it's that commonality that will bring us together. And I think it's that commonality about the Black Lives Matters, even though it's in America and yes, it is happening over there, but it's like people are raw, their heart and emotion is bigger now. So people are feeling that, they're enabling themselves to feel and to act on that. And they want change because they're already been through change. It's getting a little bit. So I think hopefully I probably don't feel I have the proper words to explain, but you can. People didn't think when we started working within the Mount Alexander Shire about changing the whole community, what they actually thought about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. People are just really cast, yeah, like that. But we've done that 10 years, maybe. There's been major changes in how people work. It feels like a giant family. There's, of course, there's lots more work to do, but that shift happens from inside, I think.
Absolutely, and it's an interesting thing that I observe a lot of us do, that when we sort of tiptoe towards talking about love and hearts, and then we think, oh, people might not take me seriously if I try and connect these concepts of love and the heart with movements and change. And then, you're saying, oh, perhaps I haven't got the proper words, but they're exactly the proper words, Kath. And we need to get better at using those words, I think, to animate our visions for the future, so that they're not just kind of academic ideas that we're talking about, this idea of heart talk and the emotional life of movements. Like, those two ideas are so powerful. So thank you for bringing the heart talk. because I think it's a really absolutely critical piece of this change-making conversation, that sometimes when we get academic about this work, which is safer, we forget the love and the heart. So they're absolutely the proper words.
Thank you, darling. And it's funny enough, I'm actually doing this in my research, is talking these words. I'm actually analysing, why we should say, I'm trying to, academically question why we shouldn't. Why isn't that what is happening? But thank you, Alex.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be doing another show on narrative, and I think this conversation feeds into that well. And I'm just looking at the clock, and I'm conscious of wanting to come to some practical ideas. So I was wondering if we could each go around and provide 3 practical either frameworks or things to read or things to do, or because this particular vantage point of fogginess, of uncertainty, of rapid change, of change happening to us makes it sometimes a bit harder to know what pathways to follow. It's not like we're in an election campaign or we're just trying to change a particular law. We don't have this sort of neat model. So I've asked this question I've made this a long question so that the person that I throw to first has had a bit of time to think. So Julie or Natalie, are you ready to jump in on that with 3 things, thoughts, tools, one of you?
Do you want to do that?
I'll give it a go. Kind of leading on from what Kath had to say, something I've noticed and something I'm trying to do is actually taking it in some ways in a different dimension from the heart, but actually taking it kind of to a more spiritual level. And for me, I'm defining that as connection to place and my connection to country. I've really noticed the solace that people are getting through gardening and how that really physically putting their hands in the earth. I think there's a whole lot of connection to place and country that we need to do. That would be my first thing. The second thing I think is around identity and place, and that we need to identify and know our place. And I think that fundamentally roots us to this earth and this place, and that grounds us in what we're doing. There's a guy called David Goodall that talks about the somewheres and anywheres, and that this kind of arrogance of being able to be in any place is partly what makes us bereft. There's a lot more to that yarn, which I won't go into, but knowing our identity and how it connects to place, I think is a really important thing to do. And what that then means is how you, like what Kath said, what is your relational relationships and how do you work with your community for change? And how do we do that together? Something I've learnt from Indigenous peoples, this lovely, beautiful picture of it's like putting up a big marquee tent and where all the poles, putting the tent up, and that, the uncles and aunts are holding the poles, and then somebody, the leader, has to say, all together now, and we all pull it up and we all rise up together. And it's sort of that attitude of we don't leave anybody behind. We do it together. It's collective. It's not competitive. We're on, the weakest link is, that, we're only as strong as our weakest link. We're only as strong as the smallest pole. I think that's really important. And we need to take action globally. Follow the money, look at where the money's going and what the corporates are doing, and just do everything you can. Emails, phone calls, demonstrations, rallies. So that's my philosophy. Connect to the earth spiritually, build your identity around place and collaborative practice with your people, and then act, follow the money and the global corporates.
Excellent. Julie, you were looking ready to jump in before.
Yeah, so it's really difficult because we've got at one level, we've got individuals, we're going to deepen our understanding of each other in the world, and we've got these huge systems that we're engaged with, and it's like, how can we bridge? What's a bridge between those two places? And actually place is the bridge between those two things. So rather than trying to take on an entire system, why not come down into the place where you are and try and impact and influence the system that's around you? So I think more place-based initiatives and this rise of localism gives us a way of bridging a group of individuals and networks that look far too complex to take on sitting outside them. So place and working in place and working locally, I think, is really important, and with all the resources we have got there, because that also allows you to deal with identity and power and the culture and anything else that's around you that's to your advantage. So that's the first thing I would say. Use place and localism as a bridge between those things. The second thing would be use networks as much as you possibly can. So, and everyone's spoken about this. It takes a network to go up against a network, or to change a network, or to implement a different network, an alternative to the ones that are currently in place. And when I'm thinking of networks, I'm thinking particularly of recruiting the unusual suspects. So one of the best articles that I read during ISO was written by Mark Carney, who's the former governor of the Bank of England. And he wrote this in The Economist. And he basically says the world is becoming more local and digital, and we have to move from being a market economy that drifted to a market society to reclaiming human values. I quote that thing everywhere I possibly can, because it's Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and it was published in The Economist. So I think we've got to go looking for the unusual suspect. So we've got to use and combine networks and people to the best way we possibly can, to create this environment of permission, because we really need a social environment of permission to walk these pathways to make it easier on ourselves, because there's considerable barriers. And the third thing is to, I don't know, it's to do with leadership. And I think for me, the leadership is really the compelling piece, because that's us. I'm not really looking to the people out there. I'm looking to the people on this screen, the people who are watching us, the people who are putting the chat comments us. It's about us learning how to distribute leadership and having more fluid ways of moving leadership through leaders and followers, and bringing a different leadership spirit and a different leadership skill set to this idea of changing complex systems, and being able to work with emergence, which is what we're talking about standing there and working with the unknown and staying in the ambiguity of that, including our relations, about not knowing what our predetermined future is. So I'd really go for leadership as my third. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And Holly, I saw you grab some books off your shelf.
Well, I just thought I had all my books in close proximity, and I am a librarian, so I thought I'd do a quick show and tell of some books that you might find useful. This one is Emergent Strategy.
I was hoping you would have that.
By Adrienne Marie Brown. And there's a lot that's interesting about this book. She's really influenced by Octavia Butler, who was a science fiction writer. And Kath, I thought you might appreciate this quote from a book by Octavia Butler. "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change." So there's a lot about kind of what we were talking about being open to change, resilient around change. And also, really looking to patterns in nature and not getting caught in kind of rigid strategy, but being, looking for emergent strategy. This is the Movement Action Plan from Bill Moyer. It's an oldie and a goldie. It's been very influential in social movements for years, but a framework that I find really useful in that is the 4 roles of activists, which talks about that there's different roles you can play in activism. You can play those roles well or poorly, and how you play them impacts on the overall success of the movement, or the roles are needed. So oftentimes we end up in this kind of competition between different approaches to change, whereas we can, have diversity in movements and find a way to respect each other, even if we don't necessarily agree about the ways, the best way to go forth and do things. So that might be something useful for people who are going, where do I fit and what could that look like? To actually see, here's a framework for understanding the different contributions people can make. This is a book called This is an Uprising by Paul and Mark Engler. And it's a big, ambitious book that tells a lot of stories about nonviolent revolt, in how nonviolent revolt is shaping the 21st century, but lots of historical stories in there. And they talk about the concepts of structure and momentum. So they're talking about how do we build like lasting organizations that can like reflect the will of the base, you know, and kind of bring people together to act collectively. So build those, you know, have strong structure, but also respond to these moments that turn up that everyone needs to get on board with. Suddenly things whoosh, take off, and they call it the moment of the whirlwind. You know, and it really requires a lot of flexibility. A whole bunch of new people come into the movement, or people who were supportive become very active very quickly. So, you know, rather than kind of being stuck in a gradual way of working, being able to, you know, move fast when needed. And I'm just mentioning this last one, strategy and soul, because I mentioned Daniel Hunter before. But it's great because it tells the story of a campaign in a really deep way. So it looks at all the experiences of the people in the campaign, the different moments that go on, the different decisions they have to make as they experience different, you know, opportunities and setbacks in the campaign. And they made a really powerful decision right at the beginning that they wouldn't hold a rally. So they came up with lots of creative tactics rather than just, you know, relying on old you know, trusty rallies that can be really boring and disempowering. So that was a quick show and tell, but so much more on the Commons Social Change Library. Yeah, there's a whole theories of change section on the Commons Library that's really relevant to a lot of the stuff we talked about. So people are welcome to check that out.
Yeah, I really, really recommend people check out the Commons Social Change Library. There's a wealth of resources being added regularly, and I think you just published, was it today or yesterday, a whole lot of new material pertaining to the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Kath, over to you for your 3 top actions, resources, tools, thoughts.
Well, I was just wondering, can I read the last bit of my letter very quickly?
You can break all the rules.
I'm so sorry, but
you can go for it.
It's just all about the change. So exactly what we're talking about. But I'll read quickly.
Go for it.
Okay.
I love it.
So people talk about the system being broken. It was never right from the beginning. A dominant system has landed itself on country and believed it was going to work. Can people see that it cannot? What else will it take? Massive bushfires? That's happened. A virus that could possibly have changed their lives forever? That's happened. Maybe change isn't a bad thing. Maybe change is just what we need. I have many of my non-Indigenous allies saying they feel helpless. What can they do? I say, sorry, and I look back and I think, helpless? Then you don't see me. You don't see us. You mustn't see how helpless we feel. Not helpless in who we are, but helpless that there are too few of us to make so much change that's needed. Too few of us with so many responsibilities and expectations placed upon us. This is for our allies. What we want is for you to make a declaration and commitment to us for change. You don't need to do it all, just maybe start with something small. As you're a part of the system, you're a part of the majority. You can also speak out for change. We actually need you. Just so that we are clear, I cannot speak for a whole race of people, but I will give you some ideas from me. We can no longer be the only ones fighting for change. This is in regards to Black Lives Matter. We need your voice in it. Change it. Any workplace that you're in, make sure you engage with us from the beginning and make our employment meaningful and long-term. Change it. Our voice should be in the decision-making from the start. Change it. Read anything you can get your hands on, written by us, recorded by us, our voices. Learn, change it. Many of us still live in poverty. Change it. We also need to fight back for curriculum change and ways of teaching our kids. If you're a teacher, please read the amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and First Nations people that write in education. Like anything else you don't know, you research it. Go to your schools and ask the hard questions, support them. This is a big one because this could bring about systematic change at the highest level and could bring about the greatest change. Don't just stand back and be a bystander. Change it. We know the cultural interface is a hard place. Guess what? It is also hard for us. Be brave, be open to learn, change it. If you ask elders or our people for advice, actively listen, make the change. Understand not everyone sees the world like you do. Too many of us going out into the world feel like we're walking into an alien's land in our own country. Our worldview is different and we prefer it. Understand this, change it. Treat our elders with respect. On this country, their word is law. Change it, that's L-O-R-E. And lastly, but not least, don't see us as disadvantaged. We are strong, we are proud, we love, we honour family, we honour country. And we will continue to fight and fight until we do not have breath, and then we will fight and fight some more. Understand this, change it. So what we are doing this Saturday at 4 o'clock is hanging out in Victory Park. There will be a lot of Aboriginal and Torres, there'll be from this community, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people there, but what we want to see is what you guys are willing to do. I think this Shire is ready to actually show the actions, not just in rallying or protesting against what's happening for Black Lives Matters over in America, but actually, what are you going to do here? We're getting tired, and we think you guys are ready to actually make that change yourself and to act. So we are wanting you guys to speak out about how you're going to make that change that's happening on Saturday.
So we're inviting all allies to come and make a declaration. We will ask you to declare what are you going to do and how you're going to change it. We're also asking people if they would prefer to have a fire at home with a gathering of 20 people, and we'll Zoom people in. So people that feel comfortable coming to Victory Park can do that, and we'll have a live Zoom and people will have fires so they can join the gathering like that. So 4 o'clock, Castlemaine's version of Black Lives Matter.
Thanks, and thanks, Cass, for that absolute touche finale to the show there. I'm sure that everyone has a lot of other things to add, but we are getting very close to time. So I think we're going to, I don't know if we could top that actually, Cass. So it was a perfect ending. And I just wanted to say we've got 2 more shows left of this season. Please leave your comments and ideas about these shows, about other topics we could tackle. And I guess just to say that when we were thinking about this particular show, we were talking about, should we define terms? Should we talk about theories of change or mechanisms of change? Should we talk about strategies or tactics? Should we talk about case studies? What should we do? And it's hard to know, because I'm inside the conversation, how much we've covered or not until I talk to other people afterwards. But my sense is that it's a great reminder that actually we have to be in conversation with each other. This is a short hour, and I don't know how many people have tuned in, but the people who are on the other side of this screen listening now, we need to get together in groups of whatever size we can and have capacity and rules. But we have to keep talking about this and share ideas with each other and draw expertise from all of these different fields and practices, and keep trying different things and rising to Cass challenge and the rest of the First Nations community here. And yeah, I feel very excited that we've been able to sort of initiate some of these conversations, and conscious that there's just a mountain more that we could go into. And when you were talking earlier, Julie, I was reminded of the beautiful quote by the late Grace Lee Boggs, who says, "We are the leaders that we have been looking for." So I think both with the invitation from Cass and the compulsion to make a better world, that's on all of us. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you, Julie, Holly, Kath and Natalie, for joining the show tonight, and behind the scenes to Emma, Matt, Jessie, Declan and Tim, who've been helping out with the tech and a part of the collective. We'll be back next week with the show looking at narrative and the role of narrative in change making. And to close out with a classic of the change making musical genre. Many thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Are on strike. They walked off the job over a month ago. Their wives, children and relatives went with them. This is the Wave Hill mob. Wave Hill is the territory's biggest cattle station, 5,186 square miles. In fact, the biggest in the world.
I think that Australians all over Australia have got to decide whether they think it's right that Macquarie Street, for example, should be owned by the Aboriginals. It goes right.
But the Aborigines aren't claiming Macquarie Street, are they?
No, but because there aren't any Aboriginals here. Are there?
He said, "Hey, you steal another man's countries." And I said, "No, well, what was before the bestie born and I born?" I said, "That was a blackfellow country."
You mob can sing along to this, eh? Then you'd all become Aboriginal idol, won't you?
Gather round, people. I'll tell you a story, an 8-year-long story of power and pride. The British Lord Vestey and Vincent Lingiari were opposite men on opposite sides.
Vestey was fat, full of money and muzzle. Beef was his business, broad was his door. Vincent was lean, spoke very little. He had no bank balance, our dirt was his floor.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Gathered the wealth of the land, and daily the pressures got tighter and tighter. Karinji decided they must make a stand. They packed up their swags and started up walking, and by Waddy Creek they sat themselves down. They said they don't sound like much, but they sure got time.
He boarded an airplane, landed in Sydney, great big city of life. A day he went around, softly speaking his story to all kinds of men from all walks of life.
Vincent sat down with them Brit politicians. This affair, they told him, it's a matter of state. Let us sort it out. While your people are hungry, Vincent said, no thanks, we know how to wait. And one day a tall stranger appeared in the land, and his name was Whitlam. Came with great ceremony, through Vincent's fingers for that handful of sand.
I solemnly hand to you these deeds as proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the security people.
Of something much more. How power and privilege could not move a people, and now where they stand, and they stand no more. Little things, big things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Our spirit walks with you. Our spirit walks with you. Good night. Go safe. Hooray.